You've entered a world where stories don't end, they linger. Where every whisper of the wind carries a warning, and every crooked house remembers the blood it was built on. This is folk fear, a collection of curses, rituals, and forgotten traditions that were never meant to survive, but did. Tonight's tale is not fiction. It is a scar carved into the land, retold by the teeth beneath the floorboards. Listen closely. The pact is still alive, and something is hungry. The house was waiting for her. It had stood for nearly 2 centuries at the edge of the village, alone on the ridge like something shunned. Its timbers leaned slightly, as though burdened by secrets too heavy for stone and wood. The wind never passed it gently. It scraped, it howled. And when it rained, the water didn't just fall, it wept through the walls. Ellen stood at the gate with the rusted key in her hand, her son clinging to the hem of her coat. She hadn't been here since she was 15, not since her mother swore she'd never return, not since the last scream had echoed from the attic room and the village held a funeral without a body. The inheritance had arrived in a brown envelope, no ceremony, no condolences, just the deed, the key, and a note in brittle handwriting. Don't enter the upper room. Burn this place if you can. But Ellen had nowhere else to go. After Daniel's death, the hospital bills, the rent, the school, the weight of widowhood, it had all hollowed her out. And so, with one suitcase and a child too young to understand grief, she returned to the house she was born in, the house that had buried every woman in her bloodline. The door creaked open like a reluctant throat. Dust swirled in the afternoon light, disturbed after years of silence. The air smelled of old wood, dried flowers, and something damp beneath the floor. Tommy wrinkled his nose. "It smells like teeth," he said. She blinked. "Teeth?" Like when the tooth fairy forgets to take the tooth and it gets yellow. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. They slept in the downstairs bedroom that night, though the house had 5 others. Ellen didn't want to be under the attic. The memory of her aunt's death lingered, found sprawled with her mouth torn open, eyes glassy with terror, no teeth in her skull. No one spoke of it. They just buried what was left. At 3:12 a.m., Ellen awoke to the sound of chewing. Soft, wet, rhythmic. She lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, then down to the wooden floor. Tommy breathed gently beside her, his small hand curled into hers. She waited, the silence stretching, until the sound came again. Chew, chew, click. She got up, careful not to wake him, and pressed her ear to the floor. Nothing. In the morning, the kitchen had shifted, not the walls or windows, but the atmosphere. Heavier. She ran her fingers along the cabinets, stopping when she found something etched beneath the shelf. Tiny scratch marks, circular patterns, almost like carvings made by fingernails or gnawed bone. Tommy sat at the kitchen table drawing with a stubby crayon. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" He flipped the page. It was a black door surrounded by twisted mouths. No eyes, no bodies, just mouths with jagged teeth. And in the center, a woman in a red dress, her mouth open in a scream. "That's Grandma," he said. Ellen's blood ran cold. "You never met her." "I see her in my room. She's sad." Ellen snatched the paper. "Don't say things like that." "She said the house is hungry," he whispered. The next day, Ellen visited the village grocer. The woman behind the counter, old and gray-eyed, went still when Ellen gave her name. "Caro," the woman said, "you came back." Ellen nodded. "It's just me and my son now." The woman leaned in, voice low. "Don't let him near the upstairs room." Ellen's stomach tightened. "You know the stories?" "We all know them. The pact was made long before my time, and it's never been broken." Ellen wanted to laugh, a nervous, desperate laugh, but the woman didn't blink. "Every woman in your line was taken by the house on her 36th birthday. The land demanded it. It still does." Ellen's breath caught. "That's superstition." The woman didn't smile. "And yet, here you are." Back home, Ellen opened the hallway closet. Behind coats and moth-eaten blankets, she found the family journal. Her mother's handwriting filled the pages, cryptic entries, dates, names of women, and their deaths. Margaret Caro died screaming, 36. Helena Caro, eyes gone, 36. Annabeth Caro, missing tongue, 36. Genevieve Caro, skull crushed from within, 36. Eva Caro, no teeth left to identify, 36. Her own name had been added, Ellen Caro. The death column was blank. Her birthday was in 21 days. That night, the chewing returned, louder, closer. Tommy woke sobbing. "They want me now. They said you're too smart. They said you're breaking the rules." Ellen pulled him close. "What rules, baby?" He pointed to the floorboards. "The ones under there." The house didn't settle that night. It breathed. Wood groaned as if shifting under invisible weight, and the floorboards pulsed with warmth, like the skin of something sleeping just beneath. Elin didn't sleep. She sat in the downstairs chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching the shadows cross slowly across the wallpaper. They moved too deliberately to be tricks of light. She didn't light a candle. Somehow, darkness felt safer than revealing what might be standing too close. When morning came, the house was quiet again, but not still. She tried to forget the journal, but it called to her like an open wound under a bandage. Around noon, when Tommy was napping, she slipped upstairs, her feet creaking on the staircase that seemed to grow steeper the longer she climbed. The hallway was lined with portraits, generations of Caro women, all pale, all solemn, none smiling. Their eyes followed her. She paused at the third door on the right, the one no one ever entered. Her hand hovered near the knob. Coldness radiated from it, as if the door breathed in reverse, but she didn't touch it. Instead, she opened the door at the end of the hall, the study, her grandfather's old room. It smelled of parchment, dried herbs, and something metallic. Inside a locked drawer beneath the desk, Elin found it, the birthday ledger, a thick, cracked leather book bound with faded sinew. Her mother had once whispered of it during a fever spell, murmuring words like obligation, balance, and sacrifice. She opened the book. It hummed in her hands. Inside were dates, names, rituals, and rules. Rules for preserving the land, rules for keeping them quiet. Each woman in the family had a page. Margaret Caro fed the floor, lost her tongue, the crops survived. Eva Caro refused the pact, famine followed, she was taken anyway. Annabeth Caro carried the burden, delivered her teeth willingly, peace for 3 winters. At the bottom of every page, a blood print, a fingerprint, or a thumb. Some had writing beneath. 36 is the age of offering. No mother escapes. The hunger begins with the child. Elin's hands trembled. She flipped toward the back, and found her own name, written in a shaking hand. Elin Margaret Caro, born July 9th, 1989. Offering due July 9th, 2025. Notes: one son born, no sisters, no twin, final bearer of the line. Underneath, a simple phrase in red ink: if the offering fails, the land cracks, the mines break, the boy is next. Elin slammed the book shut. The air shifted. From upstairs, she heard a sound she'd hoped to forget. The mirror in the attic room had begun to hum, a low frequency vibrating through the walls. It was the same sound her mother heard days before she was found, the same sound they all heard just before their screams stopped. Elin rushed to Tommy's room. He sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes blank, tracing the shape of a circle into the wooden planks with his fingertip. "Elin?" he said without looking at her. Her stomach turned. He never called her that. She knelt in front of him. "What did you say, baby?" His eyes flickered, like candlelight behind glass. He smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "The floor remembers you. It likes your mouth." Elin pulled him into her arms, heart thudding, holding him so tightly he gasped. It took a full minute before he blinked again and looked confused. "Mom, why are you crying?" She didn't answer. That night, she stayed awake and read the ledger cover to cover. The first entry was from 1814. A woman named Elsbeth Caro, alone in the house during a brutal winter. The land was dying, animals starving, children wasting, and the church would not come. No priest dared walk the fields after midnight. Elsbeth had twins, daughters. When one became ill, the other was taken. Not by Elsbeth, not by man, but by the house. The entry read, "I offered her with a prayer and a bowl of ash. The earth breathed again. I heard chewing in the walls that night, and in spring the barley bloomed like blood." So began the pact. Elin read on. Every few decades, one daughter, always 36, always in the same room, always after the first signs, chewing, the mirror's hum, the drawing of sigils by the innocent. Some tried to run, none succeeded. One woman fled across the ocean. She was found in a motel bathtub in Maine, her mouth torn open, her teeth jammed into the sink drain. The curse was not bound by distance. It was stitched into blood. Elin slammed the book shut again and pressed her forehead to the desk. She couldn't breathe. There were still 20 days until her birthday, 20 days until the hunger peaked. She looked at the page again. Final bearer of the line. What happened when the last woman came to age? There was no answer in the book, but in her bones she felt it. The house would not simply starve, it would devour everything. The chewing began again that night, but this time it was closer. Ellen had fallen asleep in Tommy's room, curled on the floor beside his bed, the ledger clutched to her chest like a shield. Outside, the trees thrashed in a windless dark. Inside, the walls had begun their slow exhale, that ghostly movement the house made when it wanted to be noticed. At first, she thought the sound was in her dream, a rhythmic, wet gnashing like molars grinding against bone. But when she opened her eyes, the sound didn't stop. It came from beneath her, not from the basement, directly under the floorboards. Chew, chew, click, a pause, then again. Chew, click, swallow. She sat up, frozen, and placed her hand on the wooden planks. They vibrated slightly, as if something deep and ancient stirred just below, not large, not fast, but deliberate, hungry. She leaned closer and pressed her ear to the floor and heard breathing. Not hers, not Tommy's. It was slow, labored, shallow, and gurgling. She recoiled as if burned, scrambling back just as Tommy stirred under his blanket. He didn't open his eyes, but his lips moved. "They're getting louder," he whispered. Ellen stared at him. "What did you say?" "They're almost here." The next morning, she tried to rationalize. Maybe it was rodents, rats, raccoons, something simple. She pulled on gloves and moved furniture aside, then pried up one of the floorboards near the center of the room. It cracked loose with a moan, revealing dirt, dry, undisturbed. She dug with her hands. Nothing. No tunnels, no hair, no bones. She put the floorboard back, but the feeling didn't leave. The vibration had been real, the breath real, the chewing undeniably there. Tommy wouldn't speak all day. He just drew, page after page after page. Ellen finally looked at them in the evening, spread across the floor like some demented gallery. All the drawings were the same. A room with a woman kneeling, and mouths, hundreds of mouths drawn into the floor, all open wide, all with no eyes, just rows of broken, jagged teeth. One drawing showed the woman tearing her own teeth out. Another showed a child lowering a bowl of molars into a hole. Another was of Ellen. She stood in the center of a bleeding circle, her mouth gone. Nothing remained but a hole stretching across her face. "What is this?" she asked him, trembling. Tommy didn't look up. "They asked me to draw it. They said it helps them wake up faster." That night, she boarded up the attic door. With real nails, real wood, she hammered until her arms shook and splinters bit into her palms. She did it for herself, for her sanity, but also to protect Tommy. The mirror had hummed again the night before, the kind of hum that vibrated your teeth and blurred the edges of your vision. She wouldn't let him hear it. She wouldn't let it claim him. But when she returned downstairs, Tommy stood in the center of the hallway, holding a mouthful of dust. "Ellen," he said again. "Not Mom, not Mama. Ellen, the boards don't like being closed. They said your blood's getting late." He opened his fist. Inside were 5 tiny white shapes. Teeth. But not his. She looked closer. Old. Stained. Human. She dropped them like they were burning. "Where did you get these?" He pointed to the wall. "They came through the cracks when I sang to them." Later, after Tommy was asleep, Ellen sat in the hallway and watched the floor. There was something there now, a bulge beneath the wood, slight like swelling skin. She touched it, and it pulsed, once. The ledger said the signs would intensify. It said the house would grow restless in the final days, that the chewing would spread from the floor to the dreams, to the walls, to the body itself. She flipped to the last entry, the one her mother never finished. The ink was smudged, the handwriting frantic. "I thought I could ignore the gnawing. I thought if I stayed quiet it would pass me by. But now they whisper from the drain. They told me to bite my son. I think I almost did." Ellen closed the book. Her gums ached. She reached up instinctively and pressed on one of her molars. It was loose, not a little loose, swinging. She staggered to the bathroom and turned on the light. Her reflection met her. She opened her mouth and leaned in. The gum was split, blackened around the root, and carved into the back of the tooth was a symbol, one she'd seen in Tommy's drawings, a spiral of mouths. The next morning, she took Tommy to the village library hoping for answers. An old man with clouded eyes ran the archives. When she mentioned the house on the ridge, he stiffened. "You're the Caro girl." She didn't deny it. He led her into the back room, unlocked a dusty cabinet, and pulled out a book wrapped in twine. It was brittle, hand-bound, and smelled like rot. Inside were old folk tales. One of them was titled "The Mouth in the Foundation." She read aloud. "When the land hungered, the first Caro matron gave her child to the earth, but the child did not die. Its mouth was buried, and the house was built on top. Since then the mouth feeds, and it is never full. Every woman born of the pact is born with the same root, and every 36 years the teeth must return to the soil." Ellen closed the book. The man whispered, "Have you heard the chewing yet?" She didn't answer. "You will, and when you do, you'll know what must be done." That night, Ellen stood in the attic with a hammer. She had unboarded the door. The mirror no longer hummed, it screamed, a high-pitched, glassy wail that rang inside her skull. She smashed it. Shards fell like teeth. Behind the mirror was a hollow space in the wall. She tore into it, bleeding, and found a jawbone, still wet, still grinding, as if chewing on the silence. The village elder lived at the edge of the woods. His home was sunken and bent, swallowed halfway by creeping moss and the twisted arms of time. Trees leaned protectively around it, as though ashamed of what he remembered or what he had agreed to forget. Ellen hadn't seen him since she was a child. Back then, the man was just old Mr. Fenn, a quiet fixture at the village well. Now they whispered other names for him: Keeper, Watcher, the Mouthless One. He had not spoken in nearly 20 years. Some said he had offered his own tongue to the earth in exchange for a longer life. Others claimed the silence was his punishment for helping the Caro women survive the pact. But Ellen needed answers. She left Tommy with a trusted neighbor, a quiet woman who'd looked at Ellen with fear in her eyes, but took the boy without question. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps they all did. Fenn's door opened before she could knock. He was already waiting. Inside, the house was dark, not from lack of light, but from a refusal of it. The windows were covered with thick curtains stitched with strange symbols. Bones hung from the ceiling, animal bones mostly, but not all. Ellen hesitated at the threshold. Fenn gestured to the seat across from his. His fingers were thin as antlers. He did not speak, but he rolled behind him and unrolled a canvas scroll. Painted in old ink was a symbol Ellen recognized from Tommy's drawings, a spiral of mouths. But here it was part of something larger, a tree with teeth for leaves and roots stretching downward into a pit of writhing jaws. Fenn pointed to the top of the tree. A woman stood there, faceless. Beneath her feet, generations spiraled downward, women screaming, bleeding, chewing, each connected by red thread from womb to grave. And at the bottom, a single gaping mouth stitched into the base of the house itself. Ellen's voice cracked. "What is it?" Fenn picked up a piece of chalk and wrote one word on the table: Covenant. She swallowed. "Why my family?" Fenn drew a circle, then a smaller one inside it, then a dot. He pointed to the dot, then to her. Ellen's throat tightened. "You mean we're the seed?" He nodded, and then he wrote, "One daughter per generation, one offering every 36 years. One bloodline feeds the soil or all rot." Ellen gripped the edge of the table. "My mother said it was just a story, a curse." Fenn shook his head slowly. Then, For the first time in decades, he rasped a single word, cracked, dry like leaves dying in his throat. Contract. Ellen froze. It wasn't just a myth. It was a deal. One that had kept the village fed, the crops alive, the winters mild. At a cost. She stood, suddenly nauseated. So I'm just supposed to die? To let them take me? Fen stared at her with such sorrow that it felt like gravity. Then, carefully, he unrolled a second scroll. This one was newer. It showed a woman in fire, standing defiant above the house, burning it from the ground up. But the roots beneath still writhed, still chewed. At the very bottom, a boy stood alone, eyes missing, mouth open. Fen circled the boy with trembling fingers. Ellen's voice was a whisper. "Tommy." He nodded, then handed her a knife. Its blade was old, not steel, something older, something bone. Carved into its handle was the same spiral of mouths. Ellen held it in both hands. "What do I do with this?" Fen didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and began to hum, the same pitch as the mirror, the same frequency she felt in her teeth. That night she returned home with the knife wrapped in linen. Tommy sat on the floor humming softly to himself. When he saw her, he smiled, not with joy, but with relief. "They told me you were ready now," he said. "Who did?" she asked, kneeling beside him. He tapped his chest. "They live here, in the breath." Ellen pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "They won't take you." Tommy didn't reply, but he reached out and gently touched her molar, the loose one. It fell out into his hand. Later, Ellen stood in the center of the attic room. The wood beneath her felt warm, alive. The boards pulsed with breath. She stared at the walls, at the cracks, at the place where the mirror had hung, where the screams had echoed, where her aunt, her mother, her grandmother had all died on their 36th birthdays. Her own was now 14 days away. She held the bone knife and looked down and said the words the ledger had taught her, the words her bloodline was never meant to say aloud. By the roots that bind us, by the mouths that made us, I am the last leaf, and I choose fire.
Ellen had always believed that children were close to the veil. Too close, sometimes. They saw things before adults did, heard things when the world was silent, drew truths with stubby crayons that no one taught them. And when they spoke to shadows, no one ever asked why the shadows listened. Tommy hadn't spoken all morning. He just drew. Page after page, hour after hour. His hands moved in mechanical rhythm as if something deeper guided them. Not thought, not imagination, but memory. A memory not his. Ellen sat on the other side of the room, her fingers wrapped around a mug gone cold. She watched him, too afraid to interrupt. He was sketching with red. Not crayon, not pencil. It looked like chalk at first, but when he smeared it across the floor, it left a dark maroon smear. She stood quickly and rushed to him. "Tommy, where did you get that?" He looked up, blinking, as if emerging from underwater. "I found it in the wall." He held up the stub of something dry and brittle. Ellen's stomach dropped. It wasn't chalk. It was bone, carved smooth and hollowed, like an old sharpened tooth. That night, Ellen locked the drawings in the old trunk at the foot of her bed, but it didn't matter. At 2:44 a.m., she woke to the sound of scratching, not at the door, from inside the walls. Tommy's voice echoed down the hallway, calm and matter-of-fact. "They want more pictures." Ellen entered his room to find him standing on the bed, drawing on the ceiling with the bone shard. The image was crude but clear. A large spiral, the symbol of the mouth tree. Below it, rows of women, all without eyes, all missing their teeth, all bowed low, feeding something with their hands. "What are they giving it?" Ellen asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommy turned his head slowly. "They're feeding it the memories." Ellen swallowed hard. "What memories?" He shrugged. "The ones that hurt." By dawn, the attic was breathing again. Ellen didn't open the door. She knew what waited there. She could feel the throb of it through the walls, the pulse of a mouth that had never closed, the mouth beneath the house. She didn't have to see it. She could hear it now, every time she blinked. Chew, swallow, click. Chew, swallow, wait. The drawings began to bleed through the walls. They appeared behind wallpaper, on the undersides of shelves, even beneath her own skin. One night, while washing her arms in the sink, Ellen noticed a faint shape just beneath the surface of her wrist. She scraped gently, then harder, until blood welled up, and beneath the thin layer of skin, faintly, horrifyingly, was a mouth, a drawn mouth, etched like ink into her muscle. It opened slightly, then vanished. The next morning, Tommy was gone. His bed was empty, his window wide open. Footprints in dust led to the attic. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. "No!" She ran. Up the stairs, to the door. It was already open. The boards she had nailed weeks ago were torn away like paper. Inside, the air was thick and wet, like stepping into the lungs of something that had only just begun to rot. And there, in the center of the attic floor, was Tommy, kneeling, drawing with both hands now. He had used the bone shard to carve into the floorboards, symbols, mouths, spirals, names, her name, over and over again. Ellen, 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 Ellen. "Ellen!" she cried. He didn't look up. His voice was calm. "They said I have to prepare the room for your birthday." She dropped to her knees, shaking. "Baby, please, come away from there." But he kept carving. "They said if I draw it right, you won't feel anything. It'll just happen like it did for them." He finally looked at her, and for a split second, Ellen didn't see her son. She saw the first daughter, the one buried beneath the house, the one who began the pact. Her eyes were Tommy's, but older, endless, wounded. Ellen crawled toward him and seized the bone tool from his hand, tossing it across the room. He didn't resist. He simply whispered, "They're almost awake now." That night, Ellen lit every candle she could find. She sat in the middle of the living room, surrounded by Tommy's drawings, now taped to the walls, the windows, the floor. She no longer had the strength to pretend. The house was remembering, and it was teaching her son to obey. She opened the ledger again, flipped to the final page, and there, scrawled in fresh ink she hadn't written, was a new line. "The boy will carry the mouths now." In her dream, she saw the house open like a wound. The roof peeled back, the walls groaned, and beneath the foundation, beneath the rot and the bone and the mud, was a great jaw, made of every Caro woman before her. It moved slowly, as if whispering a lullaby in reverse, and when it opened, Ellen saw not fire, but herself, smiling, toothless, waiting. It began with the knocking. Soft at first, barely audible above the groan of the old house and the windless stir of the trees outside.
Ellen stirred beneath her blanket, curled on the floor of Tommy's room. She had started sleeping there again, out of fear more than comfort. The house had grown colder in recent days, not in temperature, but in presence, as if something was slowly withdrawing warmth from the walls, harvesting it for something yet to come. She checked the clock. 12:01 a.m. The knocking came again, but not at the door. From beneath the bed, 3 slow, deliberate raps. Ellen's breath caught in her chest. She reached for the flashlight beside her, flicked it on, and slowly leaned down to peer beneath the bed. Nothing. Just dust, shadows, and something carved into the wooden floor beneath. A bowl, a tooth, a spiral, a name. Her name. Ellen. She turned quickly. Tommy was sitting up in bed, eyes still closed. "They're ready for you." She didn't sleep again that night. Instead, she followed the whispers. They called her through the walls, gentle at first, like lullabies through rotten wood. But the longer she resisted, the more insistent they became. At 2:13 a.m., the floor beneath the kitchen shifted, not visibly, audibly. The boards creaked inward like a breath being drawn in. She stepped lightly toward the sound and felt the center plank dip under her foot. She remembered something. When she was a child, her mother had once mentioned a cellar, but there was no door, no stairs, just a sealed, forgotten hatch that no one dared open because it wasn't for them. It was for the mouth. Ellen crouched beside the center plank and pressed her palm to it. It was warm, beating. She ran her fingers along the seams until one nail caught a hidden groove. She scraped, dug, until the edge lifted slightly, just enough to reveal a brass ring embedded in the wood. She pulled. The floor moaned, and a breath of warm, damp air escaped, carrying the scent of wet soil, iron, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. She stared down into the darkness below, a hollow space, carved by hands, smoothed by time, waiting. She lit a candle and descended the narrow wooden ladder. Each rung creaked like a groan. The walls closed in the deeper she went, dirt giving way to clay, clay giving way to something darker. The air grew heavier, wetter. She could hear water dripping, but could not tell from where. Then her foot touched stone. She had reached the bottom. It was not a cellar. It was a chamber. A circle carved into the earth, lined with bone. Hundreds of tiny bones, arranged in patterns like teeth set in a monstrous jaw. In the center of the chamber sat a bowl. Stone, wide, shallow, filled not with water, but with teeth. Some still had roots, some were shattered, some were far too large to be human. Above the bowl, dangling by ancient frayed threads from the beams above, hung jaws, not full skulls, just the lower halves, each still bearing rows of decaying teeth fused with wood, bone, and dirt. They clicked softly, as if chewing the silence. Ellen stepped forward, candle trembling in her grip. The whispers grew clearer now, not voices exactly, cravings. She understood without hearing. The house was starving. The offering was overdue. She glanced down at the bowl and felt a pull, not physical, but ancestral, a pressure behind her eyes, a tightness in her gums. Her hand moved without her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the molar that had fallen days ago. It sat in her palm like a curse. With a slow breath, she dropped it into the bowl. The chamber exhaled, a deep, slow release of air, like something satisfied. Then, silence. Ellen turned to climb back up, but before she reached the ladder, something in the darkness moved, a scraping, followed by a thud. She turned. At the far end of the chamber, where the stone wall curved inward, a small gap had appeared, no bigger than a crawl space. Inside, she saw not light, but teeth. Embedded in the walls, in the floor, and in a mound of something pulsing, something shaped like a woman. She crept closer, candlelight flickering. The mound wasn't earth, it was bodies, half-rotted, jawless, pressed together like clay. Dozens of them, some with familiar eyes, all women, all Karos, their mouths sewn shut with roots and thread, yet still moving, chewing, gnawing at air that wasn't there. One lifted her head, barely. Her face was a ruined echo of Ellen's own. She mouthed something. "Feed the boy." Ellen stumbled backward, shaking. "No." But the others joined in, silent, voiceless mouths, all opening and closing in unison. "Feed the boy. Feed the boy. Feed the boy." She fled the chamber, slamming the hatch shut above her, nailed it closed, then collapsed on the kitchen floor and wept. But the whisper followed her into sleep, and in her dream, Tommy stood at the top of the stairs, holding the bowl of teeth. He looked down at her, smiling, and whispered, "It's okay, Mommy. You're the offering now."
The door opened by itself. Ellen hadn't touched it. She'd passed the attic hallway a dozen times that morning, her mind fogged from the nightmare of the night before. The bowl, the teeth, the mound of women beneath the floor still gnawing long after death. But when she glanced toward the third door on the right, the one no one in the Carroll line dared open, it was no longer shut. It stood ajar. And behind it, silence. A silence so dense it pulled at the lungs, like trying to breathe underwater. Tommy stood at the other end of the hallway, staring. "They said it's time to remember," he whispered. Then he turned and walked back to his room, leaving her alone before the threshold of the room where every woman in her bloodline had died. The wallpaper was the first thing she noticed. It hadn't aged, not like the rest of the house. The room was preserved in some invisible amber, untouched by dust or mold. It smelled faintly of lavender, though the scent was old, like perfume left on a corpse too long. In the center of the room stood a mirror, or rather, what was left of one. It had shattered weeks ago when Ellen destroyed it, and yet here it was again, whole, polished, waiting. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. The floor moaned beneath her weight, not from age, but from recognition, as though it knew her, welcomed her. She approached the mirror slowly, candle in hand. Her reflection was wrong. Not delayed, not reversed, wrong. It smiled before she did. Its mouth moved slightly too wide. Its teeth were perfect, too perfect. Every one polished and symmetrical, unnaturally white against bloodless gums. Then the reflection blinked, and its mouth opened into a scream. No sound came through the glass, but Ellen felt it. A shock wave of pure grief, rage, pain, fear, centuries of it compressed into one eternal wordless cry.
She staggered backward, hand pressed to her own lips. And then the mirror cracked. Thin spider webs of glass began to emerge across its surface. And from each crack, a face began to emerge. Her grandmother, her mother, her aunt, and dozens of others she didn't recognize but felt. They all opened their mouths, no tongues, no teeth, just dark, endless holes where voices had once lived. And then the sound came, a chorus of screams. It didn't come from the mirror. It came from the walls, the boards, the ceiling, the very air. A sound soaked in centuries of sacrifice. Every death replayed at once. Every offering shrieked into eternity. It built and built until Ellen dropped to her knees, hands pressed to her ears, candle fallen and extinguished. Still the screaming continued. She crawled toward the window, gasping for light, but the curtains were nailed shut. Only the mirror glowed now, pulsing like a wound, drawing her days, and in it she saw herself, alone in the room, mouth wide open, eyes glassy, dead. She woke on the floor, choking on silence. The mirror was blank again, the room quiet, but something had changed. There were marks on the walls, handprints, hundreds of them, all bloody, some small, child-sized, others larger, women's hands, fingernails broken, clawing for escape. And on the floorboards, directly below where she'd collapsed, the wood was darker, stained, as if the blood had never dried. Ellen rose shakily. Her jaw ached. She reached up, and her fingers came away red. One of her teeth was gone. She hadn't even felt it leave. She stumbled from the room and bolted the door shut behind her, nailed it closed with trembling hands. But she knew the barrier meant nothing now. The house had welcomed her. The ritual had begun. That evening, Tommy refused to eat. He sat in silence at the table, eyes fixed on the floor beneath him. "They're almost done remembering," he said quietly. Ellen knelt beside him, wiping his hands with a warm cloth. "Who's remembering?" He looked up at her, not afraid, just tired. "The women, all of them. They say when you scream, it's how the house breathes." Ellen trembled. "Did they scream when it was their time?" Tommy nodded, but not from pain, from grief. He leaned forward and whispered into her ear. "They didn't want to leave their children behind." That night, Ellen slept in the downstairs parlor, doors locked, nails in the windows, but it didn't help. At exactly 3:00 a.m., the air changed. It didn't cool, it flattened, like being pressed between glass and dirt. She sat up, heart pounding. Something was different. She looked toward the hallway, and she saw the light, a dim, reddish glow, spilling from the seams of the attic stairs above, like candlelight filtered through blood. Then she heard it. Footsteps, not heavy, barefoot, small. Tommy. She ran. Up the stairs, past the portraits of the women who had come before her, their eyes now bleeding black across the canvas. The door to the room of screams was open. Inside, Tommy stood before the mirror, hands clasped. His reflection was gone. In its place stood a woman with Ellen's face, her mouth stretched wide, eyes vacant. Tommy turned slowly. "They said they won't take me if you finish what they started." Ellen's breath shuddered. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. He just pointed to the floor. and under his feet, the boards cracked open.
The floorboards opened like a mouth. Not metaphorically, literally. Ellen stared in stunned silence as the wood beneath Tommy's feet split, not with violence, but with purpose. The cracks didn't splinter. They peeled, curling upward like lips drying in the sun. And beneath them, teeth. Dozens, hundreds, embedded in the dirt, in the wood, in the stone. Some yellow, some blood-stained, some still twitching. Tommy didn't flinch. He stepped backward slowly, his eyes glazed over. They're ready now. They want to feed. Ellen grabbed his arm and yanked him away, just as the cracks began to widen, revealing not just teeth, but jaws. Full, ancient jaws, bone fused with floor, connected by roots and tendons that shouldn't be alive, but they were moving, chewing, softly at first, then faster, gnashing air, gnashing memory, gnashing expectation. The attic shook with a wet sound, a gurgling that echoed from below the house, like something vast was swallowing a river of bone. The air filled with the scent of old blood and cedar, and something sweet, rotten sweet, tooth decay sweet. Ellen stumbled back, pulling Tommy behind her, but the mirror flashed, and in it she saw herself, not as she was, but as she was becoming. Her reflection grinned wide, every tooth missing. Only black, slick gums remained, gums that pulsed with breath, that opened wider and wider until her entire head was just one gaping scream. Ellen looked away, but she could still hear it. Not the scream, the chewing. They fled the attic and slammed the door shut, but the house no longer obeyed locks. That night, the chewing came closer, not just in the attic, not beneath the floor, in the walls. Ellen sat against the parlor door, clutching the bone knife Mr. Fenn had given her. The walls vibrated, the candle flames bent sideways, and somewhere behind the plaster, she could hear swallowing. She turned to Tommy. "What do they want?" He didn't answer at first. Then softly, "They want your grief. It tastes better than fear." In the early hours before dawn, Ellen returned to the trap door in the kitchen, the one she had nailed shut. The nails were gone, not removed, swallowed. She pried the hatch open with the knife and descended into the dark. The air was thicker now, like breathing through cloth soaked in honey. The bowl of teeth in the center of the chamber had tripled in size, and it was no longer just a bowl. It had grown limbs. Wooden ribs rose from the rim like insect legs. Roots wrapped around its base, pulsing. And beside it were gifts from the house. 3 baby teeth, wet and gleaming, laid out in a line, with a note scratched into the dirt beside them. "He was never yours." Ellen screamed. Her voice hit the chamber walls and teemed back in echoes not her own. Dozens of women crying out with her, through her. Each scream folded into the next until the walls themselves trembled. The chewing stopped for just a moment, then resumed, faster now. She backed out of the hole and slammed the trapdoor shut, this time hammering it closed with the bone knife's hilt. The house groaned in protest. Plaster cracked above the door frames. Dust rained from the ceiling. But Ellen didn't stop until the hatch was sealed again. The next evening, Tommy brought her a drawing. It was folded in half. On one side, a picture of their house, warped, hunched, with teeth along the roofline,
and eyes beneath the shutters. On the other side, a picture of Ellen, on her knees, holding out a bowl filled with her own teeth. A line of women stood behind her. Each looked like her, each more decayed than the last. Ellen whispered, "Is this what they want?" Tommy nodded. His voice was barely his. "They say it's not about death, it's about tradition." Ellen snapped. She took the drawing, the knife, and the ledger and stormed into the attic. She didn't care that the walls pulsed now, didn't care that the air buzzed like flies in her ears. She stood in the middle of the room, dropped the drawing to the floor, and screamed, "I am not like them! I won't die screaming for your feast!" The house replied, not in words, in movement. Every board in the attic flexed inward, like ribs squeezing a throat. The mirror shattered again, and behind it, the mouth opened, massive, round, filled with every tooth that had ever been given, a spiral of chewing, clicking, swallowing, and from the center, her mother's voice. "It's not about you, Ellen. It never was." The floor split beneath her. She fell, not far, but deep, into the same cavity beneath the house. This time, not alone. The mound of bodies was gone. In their place, a circle of women, transparent, pale, wearing her face. Each one was a version of herself, one with her mouth stitched, one with eyes gouged out, one with her chest caved in, one with her hands tied behind her back. They looked at her and whispered in unison, "Make your choice, bite or burn." She woke in her bed, soaked in sweat, her pillow wet with blood. Another tooth, gone. No pain, just less of her than before. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself, and for a split second, she smiled. Not by choice, but because something inside her did. The rot had entered her skin. Ellen could feel it now, not just in her teeth or her dreams, but in the marrow of her bones. A low hum behind her eyes, a tightening beneath her gums, a heat beneath her fingernails, like something pushing up from underneath. When she smiled at Tommy that morning, her lips cracked at the corners. He didn't notice. Or perhaps he was pretending not to. He simply slid a glass of water toward her and whispered, "You don't look like yourself anymore." And he was right. She didn't. Her hair had gone dull, brittle, her eyes bloodshot, sunken. When she spoke, her voice trembled with something just beneath it, like another voice trying to rise through hers, a wet one. And when she brushed her teeth that morning, she counted 7 missing. No pain, no blood, just empty space. By noon, her hands had begun to itch. Not on the surface, beneath. She sat by the window scratching at her palms with the tip of the bone knife, trying to release whatever trembled inside. The skin split easily, too easily, and beneath it she saw movement, tiny threads, roots. Not metaphor, not madness, actual fibers of wood or something like it, threading themselves through her veins. She pressed her hand against the windowsill to steady herself. The wood felt warm. It pulsed, in time with her heartbeat, or hers with its. Tommy brought her another drawing. This one was of a tree, tall and dead, its branches curled like ribs, its roots made of spines. Hanging from the limbs were jaws, human jaws, dozens of them, like wind chimes. At the base of the tree sat a woman with no face, just a mouth, open, waiting. Beneath it, written in red crayon, "When a mother forgets who she is, the house remembers for her." Ellen stared at the words, her breath slow and shallow. "I didn't write that," Tommy said softly. "They did." She began to lose time. Moments slipped like teeth from her memory. 1 minute she was boiling water in the kitchen. The next, she stood barefoot in the yard at dusk, soil packed under her nails, her mouth full of something she couldn't identify. Once, she woke in the hallway closet, wrapped in the old curtains from the attic. Her hands clenched around a mouthful of dust and something small, a molar, still warm, still hers. On the third day, she coughed something up. Not blood, not bile, something hard. She reached into her mouth and pulled it free, inch by inch, a tiny carving, made of ivory, smooth, polished. It was a miniature replica of her own skull, with no teeth. When she showed it to Tommy, he nodded solemnly. "They're making room inside you," he said. "For what?" she asked. He looked away. "For what comes next." That night, the mirror didn't reflect her anymore. It reflected the house, not the outside, but its insides. Flesh instead of plaster, bone instead of beams, tongues in the walls, eyeballs in the doorknobs, a stomach in the basement, breathing, and above it all, like a heart in the rafters, a woman, not dead, not alive, just waiting, mouth open, hands folded, wearing a necklace of her own teeth. Ellen screamed and shattered the glass, again. This time, it bled. Later, she found herself drawing. She didn't remember sitting at the table, or finding the charcoal, or clearing the space, but the drawing was already half finished. It was her, but made of bone. Not bone in place of flesh, bone in shape of flesh. A woman sculpted of jawlines and femurs, cradling a child made entirely of teeth. Beneath it, she had scrawled a single line, "I was never meant to be anything but a vessel." The house grew hotter, as if preparing to hatch. The walls began to sweat, the windows fogged from the inside, doors warped and closed without sound. The trap door beneath the kitchen pulsed with every hour, as though something inside it was kicking now, testing the strength of the hatch, like an unborn thing learning its legs. And still, the chewing continued, every night, every hour. Now it came from the fireplace, from behind the mirror, from the drains, from her mouth when she slept. She woke with bite marks inside her cheeks, her tongue raw, her pillow red. She was eating herself. And on the 7th day, she stood in front of the attic door again, the third on the right, the room of screams. And this time, it opened before she touched it. Inside, it was empty. No mirror, no furniture, no shadows. Just her mother sitting in the center of the room, hands folded. But her mother had died years ago. She smiled and opened her mouth. It wasn't her mother anymore. It never had been. It was the mouth that wore her face. It whispered, "You were never supposed to love him this much. That's not what mothers are for." Ellen collapsed, not from pain, from understanding. When she awoke, she was back in bed, Tommy beside her, asleep, his breath soft, slow, but something in his hand glinted. She pried his fingers open. Inside, the bone knife, and a folded note. In a child's writing, but not Tommy's. Finish the feast, or the boy becomes the tongue. Ellen looked at the ceiling. It was cracking, and from each crack, teeth were growing. It was time to know, not guess, not fear, know. Ellen lit a single candle and sat cross-legged on the floor beside the old trunk, the one that held the family ledger, now swollen with added pages that had written themselves. She turned to the oldest pages again. The handwriting had changed over time. Ink shifted to ash smudges, smudges into carvings, carvings into something deeper, impressions left by blood, soot, and bone dust. But they told the same story over and over. The house had to eat, and it would eat what it was owed. Always from the mother, always on the 36th year. But this time, Ellen wanted to understand why. She flipped past the names she'd memorized, Margaret, Helena, Ava, Annabeth, until she found the unmarked page, the one that had always been blank. Tonight, it was not. There were no words, just a memory inked in something that shimmered like oil. As she stared at the page, the candle flickered violently, then went out, and the room dissolved. She stood in a field of ash, black soil, empty sky, wind like the hush of morning. Ahead, a village, or what was left of one. Roofs collapsed, doors gone, faces sunken into famine. And at the edge, a house, not the one she knew, not yet, just the foundation, raw wood, wet earth, and a woman kneeling. Twin daughters lay before her, one breathing softly, the other too still. The kneeling woman, Elsbeth Carow, had hollow eyes, the kind that had seen too many burials. She held something in her hand, a tooth, small, still red at the root. She placed it into the dirt, whispered something, and when she looked up, the ground opened, not violently, but like a sigh. The earth accepted the tooth, and the hunger eased. Ellen stepped closer. The vision shimmered. Elsbeth turned and stared directly at her. Though centuries apart, their eyes matched. Elsbeth's voice rose like smoke. The pact was not made with demons. It was made with the land, and the land only asks what we value most. We offered blood to keep the crops, then bone to keep the animals, then mouths to keep our minds. Ellen shook her head. You gave them your child? Elsbeth didn't blink. I gave them a daughter, so the rest would eat. And then the earth beneath her split, revealing a womb of mouths and a single jawbone rising from the dark like a crown. Ellen gasped. The candle reignited on its own. She was back in the room, back in the present, and the ledger's blank page had changed. Now it bore a single sentence. The child was never taken. She became the house. She stood too quickly and nearly fell. The walls around her creaked with understanding. All this time she had thought the mouth beneath the house was a spirit, a demon, a curse. It wasn't. It was a woman, the first, the sacrificed. Elsbeth's daughter, never fully dead, never fully alive. She had become the house, fed by the mouths of her descendants, reborn each generation as ritual, as hunger, as story. And now she wanted Ellen. She found Tommy in the hallway. He looked up at her with hollow eyes. They said you saw it, he whispered. Ellen nodded. I saw everything. He reached out and touched her face. They told me, if you don't feed them, the mouths will find someone else, someone younger. She pulled him close, heart breaking beneath her ribs. They won't take you. But what if I want them to? He asked softly. What if it means you get to stay?
"No," she said, shaking. "You're not part of this pact." He looked up. "You are." That night she dreamed again, this time not of the house, but of herself, buried beneath it, her body bent in unnatural ways, mouth pried open, teeth pulled one by familiar hands. Each ancestor visited her in turn, Helena, Annabeth, Ava. Each kissed her forehead, took a tooth, and whispered, "We died screaming because we loved too late." She awoke bleeding, her gums torn, 2 more teeth on the pillow. She staggered to the bathroom, stared at her reflection. This time, she didn't cry. She just whispered, "Then I will love early, and I will love loud, and I will not die screaming." Ellen opened the trapdoor for the last time. This time, she carried the knife. Not to offer, to end. Ellen found the drawing on her pillow. Not under it, not tucked somewhere to surprise her gently. It was placed, centered, intentional, like an offering. The page was white. The crayon was black. In the image, a boy stood in the middle of the house, with his mouth open, his hands tied behind his back, and his eyes hollow. Below him, the floorboards had opened like petals, teeth spiraling outward. At the bottom, a single word written in jagged red strokes: "Ready." Ellen knew then they had spoken to him directly, not through symbols, not through dreams, in voice. The kitchen was quiet, too quiet. No humming fridge, no groaning pipes. Even the chewing had stopped, as if the house was holding its breath. Tommy sat at the table, swinging his legs beneath the chair. His hands were folded in front of him, innocent, ordinary, except for what sat in the center of the table. A small wooden bowl, empty, but freshly carved, still damp with sap or blood. Ellen didn't speak. She sat down across from him. Tommy looked up at her with tired eyes. "They told me you're too stubborn," he said softly. "So now it's my turn." "No," she replied immediately. "They said I could end it." His voice didn't tremble. "If I give them something now, something bigger than teeth, they won't take you." Ellen felt her heart collapse inward like a dying star. "No," she whispered again. But he continued, "They want memory, joy, love, all the things I feel when I look at you. That's what tastes the best." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bone knife, laid it gently on the table. "I think I have to cut it out." Ellen knocked the knife away with a sudden cry, grabbing the bowl and flinging it across the room. It hit the wall and shattered, not like wood, like glass. The shards hissed as they scattered, each one whispering a different name: Helena, Margaret, Annabeth, Ellen. Then finally, Tommy. She ran with him, out of the house, into the woods. She didn't care about the thorns or the dark or the whispers that chased them between the trees. For the first time in weeks, she breathed air that wasn't filtered through mouths. But even out here, she could feel the pull. The ground beneath her feet ached for them, and Tommy was growing colder. Not physically, spiritually. His eyes unfocused, his voice quieter, like something inside him was being chewed away, bit by bit. They reached the old chapel at the far edge of the village, abandoned for years, its cross broken, the stained glass shattered. Ellen collapsed against the altar, holding Tommy in her arms.
He was trembling now. "Mom," he whispered. It was the first time in days he'd called her that. "I'm not all here anymore." I clutched him tighter. "I'll bring you back." They said I could leave if I went willingly, just one part, like a toe, or a tooth, or a song. She pulled back, looked into his face. "What did you give them?" Tommy smiled just a little. "I gave them the feeling I had when you held me that night Dad died, that warm feeling. I thought it would be enough." Ellen broke, silently, a scream held behind clenched teeth, because she remembered that night, the way he'd clung to her, the way she'd whispered, "I'll never let anything take you." And now he had given it away, freely, to save her. But it hadn't been enough, because when they returned to the house, the trapdoor was open and the spiral was glowing. Ellen didn't speak. She lifted Tommy into her arms and carried him to her room, the one farthest from the attic. She wrapped him in blankets, held him against her chest, kissed his forehead again and again, as if she could press the memory back into him. But it was gone. When he looked at her, that memory wasn't there anymore, just the absence of warmth, the echo of sacrifice. At midnight, the chewing returned, not just from the floorboards, but from inside the walls, from the boy's breath. Ellen stood in the center of the parlor, bone knife in one hand, family ledger in the other. The final pages had finished writing themselves. Under the heading, "Last of the Blood," a single instruction: the pact is not broken when one dies. The pact breaks when one chooses to live differently. She looked toward the stairs. The attic door had opened again. The light behind it was red and waiting. Tommy stirred in the blankets behind her. "I'm sorry. I just didn't want you to scream." Ellen turned to him, and for the first time, she smiled without pain. "I will, but not for them." The forest behind the house was never meant to grow. It was planted, root by root, to bury something, to hold the boundary. Ellen remembered that now, as she stood barefoot at the edge of it, her arms trembling, the wind pressing whispers into her ears like secrets she had once agreed to forget. Behind her, the house pulsed. Ahead of her, the trees leaned in like witnesses. She was holding the bone knife in one hand and a torn page from the ledger in the other. The page had appeared that morning. No title, just one sentence. "If the mouths do not close, the bark must open." She entered the woods just before sunrise. The sky behind her bled gray into blue, but inside the tree line, it was still dark, the kind of dark that didn't wait for light. The trees were wrong here, too symmetrical, too still, each one marked. She touched the bark of the first, smooth, then rough, then grooved faintly, like teeth marks, like something had been chewing from inside the trunks, as if the house wasn't the only one that fed, as if the land was full of mouths waiting to wake. Midway through the grove, she found the circle, 12 trees grown in a perfect ring. Their roots were exposed, twisted together like clasped hands or interlocked jaws. In the center, a stump, blackened, stained, and carved with the Caro symbol, a spiral of mouths,
The same symbol Tommy had drawn again and again, the same one her teeth had etched into her dreams. Ellen knelt beside the stump and unfolded the page again. There were new words now, written in something dark, fresh. Blood or ink, it didn't matter. If the mouths do not close, the bark must open. She drew the bone knife across her palm. The blood fell onto the stump in slow drops. Each one was met with a vibration, deep underfoot, like the earth was listening. The stump pulsed once, twice, then cracked. A narrow mouth split open in the wood, revealing not rot, but flesh, pale, wriggling, formless, hungry. It opened wider, and from the depth of it she heard a voice, her mother's. I tried to stop it, Ellen, but I loved too late. You still have time. Ellen shook her head. No, I don't want time. I want to end it. The roots tightened. The trees leaned in. The forest held its breath. Back at the house, Tommy was no longer sleeping. He stood in the attic, barefoot, surrounded by his own drawings. He had laid them out in a spiral across the floor, each one a version of Ellen, screaming, crying, bleeding. In each, her mouth was gone, her hands outstretched, and beneath her feet, the spiral of teeth. The room was quiet, but the mirror was whispering again. He leaned in close. Will it hurt her? He asked. The reflection, now a version of Ellen with black eyes and a stitched jaw, nodded once, but slowly. Tommy looked down at his hands. One of them held a new tooth, still warm, still pulsing. He didn't know where it came from, but he knew where it was meant to go. Ellen returned just after dusk, her hand wrapped in linen, her face pale. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just walked, slowly, deliberately, up the stairs and into the attic. Tommy met her at the door. Their eyes met, no words. He opened his hand, showed her the tooth. She reached for it, but stopped halfway. Something shifted behind her ribs, a sharpness, an ache, a realization. The house wasn't just hungry for flesh, it was hungry for ritual. It needed them to follow the steps. It needed them to agree, to obey, to believe. Ellen turned from the tooth, from the boy, from the attic, and walked to the kitchen. She pulled open the drawer, took the old flint and oil, and poured it across the wooden floor, each step soaked in memory, in blood, in the weight of every woman who had knelt in this house and whispered, "Let me be enough." She lit the match and waited. The flames didn't rise like fire. They rose like voices. Each lick of flames sang a name. Helena, Margaret, Annabeth, Eva, Ellen, and one more, Tommy. Not as offering, but as an ending. The spiral had no more names to take, and for the first time, the chewing stopped. The house burned silently. No screams, no wind, just the sound of bark cracking, roots snapping, and a single whisper. Let the mouths rest. In the ashes, days later, the village found no bodies, only a single jawbone, wrapped in linen, and tucked beside it, a drawing of a woman holding a child, both of them smiling, both of them whole. The ash had not cooled. It should have. The fire had devoured the house from attic to root. Ellen had watched it collapse in on itself, flames licking the sky like tongues finally set free. And yet now, as she walked the scorched remains barefoot, she could feel the heat rising from the ground, slow and rhythmic, like breath from an unseen throat. She stood at the center of what was once the kitchen. The trapdoor was gone. In its place, a hole, a perfect circle, burned clean through the foundation. Dark, wet, breathing. The mouth beneath the house had survived. Of course it had. Because the house had never been the curse. The house had been the mouth's skin. Now the skin was gone, and the thing inside was finally awake. Ellen turned to Tommy, who stood a few feet behind her, wrapped in the charred remains of a wool blanket. He was thinner now, quieter, but still present, still hers. He looked at the hole with solemn eyes. They said it would open for the last one. Ellen didn't ask who they were. She knew now. They weren't ghosts, weren't demons. They were ancestors made into hunger, mothers turned into mouths. She stepped toward the opening. The air grew thick. Her ears rang, and her skin, especially along her jawline, began to throb. The closer she got, the more her teeth itched. Not with pain, but with memory. Each one remembering the pull of roots from gum, the taste of iron and silence. She crouched at the rim of the opening and whispered, "What do you want from me now?" The ground didn't speak, but it answered, with a breeze, from below. It carried a smell she could not describe, like the moment before a prayer is broken, like the weight of milk teeth hidden beneath a pillow too long. She descended, not with steps. There were no stairs, only earth, warm, pulsing, shaped like a tunnel carved by something living. The deeper she moved, the more the walls shifted. First soil, then clay, then a slick black bark riddled with gums and teeth. Some intact, some shattered, some still chewing nothing. She brushed her hand against the wall. It twitched beneath her touch. The tunnel opened into a cavern. At its center lay a body, but not a corpse, and not alive. It breathed in pulses, flesh fused to root, jawbones stitched into the ribs, eyes replaced by knots of bark, and in its chest a hole, wide, hollow, a place where a heart once was, or a child. Ellen stepped closer. Her breath caught. The body had her face. Not exactly, not now, but potentially. It was what she would become if she gave in, if she fed the hunger forever, if she joined the pact as caretaker. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the final tooth, the one she had refused to offer. It pulsed in her palm like a heartbeat. The voice came then, not aloud, but inside her. "Finish it. Feed me, or I'll feed on the boy." She stood still for a long time, the tooth in her hand, the boy above her, the pact below her, the generations behind her, all waiting, all gnawing, all believing this moment must go as every moment before it. But she had learned something the others had not. The house didn't need flesh. It needed obedience. It needed a mother who would kneel. And for the first time, Ellen refused.
She stepped to the edge of the breathing body and raised the tooth above her head. Then she bit down on it, hard, shattering it in her own mouth. Blood filled her throat. The voices screamed, walls trembled, roots recoiled. The body in the center spasmed, and from deep within the cavern, the other mouths, the hidden ones, began to wail, not in hunger, but in rage, in fear, in disbelief. Ellen spat the shards into the hollow chest and said quietly, "No more." The ground erupted, not with fire, with roots. They tore from the walls like limbs from a womb, grasping at her ankles, her wrists, her jaw. But she was no longer afraid. She let them wrap around her, held them, then whispered something older than the pact, something before the pact, something her body remembered before her blood was ever promised. "You are not my God." And the roots loosened. The mouths closed, one by one. The cavern grew still, and the chewing stopped. She awoke on the forest floor, just beyond the ash where the house once stood. Tommy knelt beside her. He was crying softly. "I thought you were gone." Ellen sat up slowly, jaw aching. She reached into her mouth. All her teeth were gone, but she was still smiling. Above them, the trees swayed in a breeze that smelled not of rot, but rain. The earth no longer pulsed. It simply rested. And somewhere far below, in a hollow carved by centuries of fear, the mouth was finally full.
The house was gone. Only scorched earth remained. No walls, no roof, no attic breathing in the dark. Just ash. But Elin knew it had not truly died. It had been fed. Not with teeth, not with blood, but with something far more final: refusal. The cycle had been broken not by fire, but by choice. She stood at the edge of the blackened foundation with Tommy by her side. The boy was pale, quiet, but whole. His small hand clutched hers, and together they looked down into the charred remains of the trapdoor. The hole had collapsed overnight. Now it was filled with dirt and bone fragments, the ground sealed over like a wound trying to heal without knowing how. Elin took a slow breath. The air tasted clean, no longer tinged with iron or ash or rot. No more chewing in the walls, no more whispers in the grain. Just silence. Real silence, for the first time in generations. That night, they stayed in the village inn. Elin sat on the edge of the bed, combing her fingers through Tommy's hair as he fell asleep in her lap. He stirred only once and murmured, "Do you think it's really over?" She didn't answer immediately, because she wasn't sure. She wanted to say yes, wanted to promise him something definite, something normal. But the truth hung in the air like smoke from a long-dead fire. Finally, she whispered, "I think the house got what it wanted." Tommy frowned in his sleep. "But it wanted you." Elin looked out the window, toward the woods, where the trees still leaned like listeners. She said softly, "No, it wanted control." At dawn, she walked to the cemetery on the hill. It was small, neglected, but in the far corner stood a weather-worn stone marked
Elsbeth Carow, the matriarch, the first. Elin knelt in the dewy grass and placed a single object at the base of the grave. Her final tooth, the one she had refused to offer, cracked from when she bit down on it, still stained with the blood of defiance. "This," she whispered, "is all that's left of your hunger." And she let the wind carry the rest away. Back in the village, life resumed, or tried to. People passed her with wary glances. Some nodded, some looked away. Everyone knew something lived in the house. They just never spoke of it. That silence, the generations of denial, had kept the pact alive as much as the offerings had. But now, the story was hers to tell, or to bury. She chose to speak, quietly at first, then to anyone who would listen, about the weight of inherited pain, about how trauma can dress itself in tradition, and how fear often passes down like family recipes, in whispers, through walls, and between clenched teeth. But most of all, she spoke of choices, and how even curses can be broken when someone simply says, "No more." 1 year later, she and Tommy planted a tree where the house once stood. Not in the center, off to the side, outside the spiral. They called it the listening tree. It did not hum, it did not whisper. Its bark stayed clean, its leaves bright. But every so often, on still nights, the wind would blow through its branches just so, and Elin could swear she heard something ancient sigh. Not with hunger, not with malice, but with rest. Somewhere deep beneath the earth, in a place no longer shaped like a house, a mouth finally closed and did not open again.